In this lesson, we're going to go through how to create a basic walk cycle using Blender. Now, the first thing we need to do when preparing to create this walk cycle is make sure that the system is all set up like we need it to be. So open up the Vincent Gaming Rig Walk Blender file, and you should see something that looks like this. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that our frame rate is going to be correct. And if we look down here, currently we have it at 60 frames a second. And I want to change that to 24 frames a second. And now with that set, I want to set my timeline down here to show only the frames in the individual walk. Now what that means is I'm going to change the start position to 0 and the end position to 24. And so now when I play the animation, it will simply repeat. Now the thing about a walk cycle is that there are very key poses that a walk cycle has. And it's easiest to start with what we call the contact positions. And the contact positions look a little like this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose to set my legs first. And my legs are currently in inverse kinematic mode. And so that means if I move the bone down here, this is our inverse kinematic controller. And so I'm going to create the walk cycle using this leg in inverse kinematic mode. You'll notice that the arms are in forward kinematics. There is no inverse kinematic solver at all in these arms, so everything is driven parent down. So the parent controls the rotation and the position of the lower bones. And if I rotate the lower bones, that has no effect on the parent bones. So with auto keying enabled, what I'm going to do is set up our initial contact position. And as I do it, I switch between global and local transformations. And that just helps me orient the bones as I want, depending on what it is that I'm trying to do. And you'll notice I'm using shortcuts to move the bones and then rotate them. And so here I'm quite happy with our initial position. We have the contact position of our first step. And you notice at the moment I'm ignoring the arm. So I'm just going to work on the legs for the moment. And so then I'm going to move 12 frames forward. So a walk cycle happens on 24 frames. So halfway through is going to be the next contact point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this leg and I'm going to move it to pretty much the same position and then rotation as the original leg. And then we're going to select the other leg, and I'm going to move it back to around about the position that the previous leg was at. So now if I select all of the bones we've currently animated, and then in my dope sheet, I select all of the keyframes at frame 0, and I press Ctrl C, and I move to frame 24, and I press Ctrl V. I have now set keyframes for frame 0, frame 12, and frame 24. And we have the very beginnings of a walk cycle. But of course, this is hardly convincing. And so there are other poses that we now need to look at for this to start to actually properly take shape. And so once again, I'm going to go into the middle point of our poses. So currently we have 0, we have 12, and we have 24. And I'm going to choose the midpoint between 0 and 12, which is of course frame 6. And what I'm going to create now is the passing position. And the passing position in this case is happening on frame 6. And once I'm happy with the passing position on frame 6, we'll do the same on frame 18. And again, that's just halfway between our 12 and our 24 frame. So what you would have noticed there is I have not animated my hips correctly. During the passing position, our hips raised, but I didn't take it back down for our next pose. I didn't have a keyframe set for our hips. And so what happened was I had the hips go high and then they stayed high, which ruined all the rest of the poses. So it is important to be aware of what keyframes you're putting on what bones. You'll note that we're putting them on all the very specific times, but I haven't keyed all the bones. So for example, the upper leg and the lower leg are not actually keyed. There are no keyframes active in these bones. The keyframes are only found in our inverse kinematic controller bone and in our hip bone. And so I hadn't set the keyframe for the hip. And so the hips raised up and stayed up, like you can see at the very end here. So look down here at the bottom, you can see keyframe, 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 and then there's one missing at the end. And so our hip goes up, it goes down, it goes back up, and then we don't have a keyframe after that effect. So I need to make sure that whenever I'm setting the bones, I'm keyframing the bones at the right time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the keyframe from the 0 position and I'm going to paste it back in to the frame 24. And so now our hips are going up and down like we wanted. And so you can see we have a walk cycle that's already beginning to take effect. The legs are starting to look a little bit more convincing, which is pretty cool. So what we want to do now is just have a look at our arm swings. The first thing to notice about the arms is that arms swing counter to the leg motion. So if the leg is backwards, the arm will be swinging forward. And if the arm is swinging backwards, the leg will be forward, and vice versa. Now, when you create an arm position, it's very tempting when you first start out to simply drop the arm down, perhaps like this. And that, in your head, might be all you need to do. But if you have a look at how your arm swings when you are walking, you'll very quickly realize that the arm is led just as much by the shoulder as it is by the swing of the lower limbs. So in creating your poses, you do need to think very carefully about where your shoulder is going to go. And so I'm going to move the shoulder and rotate it on the x-axis for this initial pose. And I'm also going to choose to slightly swing our character's torso. So I've now rotated his spine just so that it swings with, oops, we probably don't want to do that, so that it swings with the actual arm as the arm is swinging backwards and forwards. And so now I can drop my arm and put it out front. And the reason you need to think about this carefully is that you'll note that as I rotate the arm or the shoulder, it swings the arm out wide or far depending on its position. So you need to think about all of this as a chain of events. You're setting a pose with all of the bones in the action that they'll be in, or the position that they need to be in. And the wider the swing, the more it'll feel like a really fast, dynamic walk. So you need to think about just how far out you want to push the arm. And on the opposite side, I'm going to move the shoulder backwards, again to follow the swing of the arm. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to again select all of my bones, and I'm going to copy them from the 0, move to frame 24, and I'm going to paste that pose onto frame 24. And so now we have two poses, but we don't have the mid pose. So what we need to do is move to frame 12 and create the opposite effect on these arms. So first let's rotate our spine again, because now he's swung across and he's onto the other side. And let's take our shoulders and rotate it back for the left arm, and then swing the arm to the reverse pose. And of course, for the right arm, we do the opposite, where we swing it forward. So now we're starting to get a bit of a pose happening, a bit of a walk cycle happening. But of course, from the front, he's swinging his arms a bit wide. We don't have much happening in the hands, and the walk cycle on the legs is still a little bit drifty. It's not quite landing on the ground like I want it. So let's have a look at how we can fix that. From the front, you can see that at frame 6 and at frame 18, the arms are coming out very, very wide. Whereas at the frame 0 and the frame 12 pose, it's not quite so bad. Frame 12 might need a little bit of work here. But one of the important things to notice in everything that I've been doing is that the keyframes are very, very clearly defined to certain poses at very specific times in the walk cycle. I don't have keyframes all over the place from 2, 3, 4. I don't have them messy. I don't have a messy timeline. I have very clear poses that I'm trying to hit. And what that means is I can very easily deconstruct where the walk cycle is going wrong or where it's going right. So in this particular case, we can see from the front that the walk cycle is not going well at frame 6. So instead of being unsure as to how to address the fix, I know exactly that frame 6 is the one that I need to start playing with. So what I'll do is I'll select the bones and I'll rotate them in. I might drop the shoulder in a little bit at this point and do the same thing on the other side here. And then I'll move to frame 18, and you can see the same thing needs to be done on this one. So let's have a look at our walk cycle now. It's starting to look a little bit better. He's a little bit less, his arms are a little bit less out. You could still do a lot more to bring those arms in by his side, but for the moment I'm happy with that. Now let's look at our legs as they walk. So as he brings his leg up and lands on this contact position on frame 12, if we look at this leg out here, or the foot, as it's on the ground, the foot stays rotated for a very long time, until frame 18. So for 6 frames, the foot is drifting up in the air, and that's just not what would happen. As you contact the ground, you put all of your weight onto that foot. And so what has to happen is you have to display that sense of weight, especially around about now, where all of the character's weight will have transferred onto this foot. This foot needs to be grounded so that it actually bears the weight from the walk. So what we'll do is, again, halfway between our poses, in this case from frame 0 to frame 3, we're going to add another position. This position is called the down position. And it's called the down position because this is going to be the lowest point of the pose. It's where all of the weight is transferred onto the newly contacted foot. So at frame 3, I'm going to rotate this foot onto the ground and flat. And then I'm going to take our hips and I'm going to drop them down, because this is the weight-bearing moment for the walk cycle. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So at frame 15, I'm going to rotate the foot. I'm going to drop it down a little bit to make sure it'll be on the ground when I drop the hip height for the down position. And so now we have 2 positions where you can sense the weight has been transferred. Okay, so this is starting to get there. Again, it's not 100% yet. We've got lots of work we need to do. But one of the things you might be noticing is that there seems to be a bit of a frame pause. Just every repetition, our guy doesn't seem to be that smooth. And this can often be hard to pick up. One of the reasons why animation is so difficult is that it's very hard to notice 1 or 2 frames that are causing troubles. But what's actually happening here is that our system is playing frame 0 and frame 24. And so there's what we call a hold happening between these 2 frames. And what I really need to do, instead of making this 24 as our stop point or as our repeat point, I need to make this frame 23. And so what will happen now, and let me just zoom in so you can see it. Instead of playing all the way through to frame 24, we're only going to play until frame 23 before we repeat. And so now we have a much smoother walk cycle. And you can see it's a really subtle effect, but it has a really important effect on the feel of our walk. It lets us judge it a lot better. And so our walk cycle has now taken some shape, but there are many things that you can fix in all of this. So all I've done so far is put poses in, and you can see that with our dope sheet down here. You can see I've just created these poses and these keyframes. Now, if I want to improve this, I need to think about, what are the curves doing? How are these, how are each one of the limbs moving in 3D space? And the way we can look at that is through the graph editor. Now the graph editor provides a way of looking at how each object is moving through 3D space. And when you first load it up, you'll see some curves, but one of the things you might find is that you select an object that is moving and you can't see much by way of movement. So what might help is to click this button called Normalize, and that will then let you see your movements a little bit more clearly. So what we want to do is look at where all of the movements are happening with our walk cycle. So let's look at our hips. And when you select the hips, you'll find there's a whole bunch of different lines that you can see. So come to the waist control in this case and open this out. And then you'll notice all of these little eyeballs. Hide all of the rotation ones and hide all of the scale ones. And in doing so, now you can see the X, Y, and Z travel of our guy, of our character. And so when we look at this, you'll see there's some strange effects here. Our character on one part of the walk cycle has got a different path for the other half. And what you really want to find is that these paths are equal, because the first half of the walk cycle is the same as the second half, just mirrored on the other side of the body. So you'd expect these sorts of controls to look identical while reversed for both sides. So let's have a look at the effects of this. Now what this tells me is something quite important, looking at our hips. When you talk about the poses that a character goes through, we call this the contact position, we call this the down position, we call this the passing position. And then just before the contact position, we have an up position. And one of the things that you'll notice is that firstly, we don't have a keyframe in the up position. And secondly, the up position is not the highest point of the character's arc. So we need to fix this now. And this is where some of the strength of looking at the curve editor really helps you define where the problems might be. So you have your poses, and now you can look at the flow of those poses and how well they're actually working. So let's create our up position. Now the curve editor can be a lot more difficult to use than just looking at the dope sheet. And here's an example of why that can be. It can be very confusing to look at. So if you notice, every time I lift the hips up, the curve editor goes down. And that's because the bone itself is inverted and its local coordinates point down. So when you lift it up, it's going the opposite direction. Now that is really confusing. And so you'll need to spend some time to really get your head around exactly how this curve editor works, and be warned that it can be different depending on what piece of software you use. All right, so we now have the very beginnings of a walk cycle. This is a very basic walk cycle. And there's lots that you can go through and look at and say, this can be fixed up or changed. But in essence, this is how you create a walk cycle. The first thing you want to do is create your contact positions. These are the opposite contact points of a walk cycle. So frame 0, frame 12, and frame 24, you can create these opposite walk steps. And then you want to create your passing position. And the passing position is named, so to speak, because your foot is passing the other foot and your arms are passing each other, making their way towards the next contact point. So what you've done is you've broken it down into the first two key poses. And then you divide it into two more key poses, which are the passing position. And then from there, you want to create your down position and your up position. And the computer will take care of the rest.